The wind cut across the valley like icy knives, slicing through the thin line of pine trees and rattling the old cabin's logs. Mara Ellison pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders, shivering as the draft snaked through the cracks between the logs. The fire in the iron stove burned brightly, but its warmth barely reached the far corners of the small cabin. She had spent months preparing for winter, hauling wood, patching the roof, and reinforcing the floor, yet the cold still seemed to find a way inside. Every gust of wind whispered threats of snow and frost, daring her to survive the coming months. Mara had bought the cabin from an old traveling agent, a man who had promised solitude and a quiet life. Cozy, just enough for one, he had said. Cozy was a lie. The cabin was ancient, its logs warped and weathered, the gaps between them wide enough for the wind to sneak inside at will. Yet Mara had not come here to give up. She was a woman who had spent her youth traveling the plains, learning to read the land, to understand it, to bend it to her needs without breaking herself. She crouched beside the far wall, fingers brushing against the floorboards where wind slipped in like smoke. Her mind worked through old lessons, her grandfather's stories of frontier cabins that held heat through blizzards, even when the snow piled high outside. They had used sand and clay to fill gaps, mixed with ash from the fire to bind it all together. The mixture hardened like stone and sealed the cabin against winter's bite. Mara stood and paced slowly, considering the materials she had at hand. Sand from the creek bed, clay dug from the bank near the barn, wood ash from the stove. If she combined them correctly, perhaps she could seal the cabin completely. Perhaps she could make the walls strong enough to trap heat inside. She gathered her tools, a shovel, a small bucket, and her old iron pan, and stepped into the fading light outside. Snow had already begun to dust the hills, and the wind whipped at her hair as she dug into the damp clay along the creek. It stuck to the shovel in heavy clumps, promising the strength she needed. Nearby, a pile of sand waited, coarse and granular. She carried bucket after bucket back to the cabin, stacking them near the stove where she could mix them safely. Inside, she poured clay into the pan and added the sand carefully, stirring the mixture with a wooden spatula until it thickened. Then she scooped in the fine ash from the stove, stirring until the paste was gritty but cohesive. It smelled earthy and warm, and Mara smiled faintly. This would work. She pressed her hands into the mixture, testing it against one of the widest cracks between the logs. The paste clung firmly, filling the gap and hardening slightly under her touch. Step by step, crack by crack, Mara moved along the walls, pressing the sand, clay, and ash into every seam. Hours passed. The fire burned steadily, casting shadows on the walls as she worked, mixing water into the paste to keep it pliable. By midnight, her hands were covered in gray and brown residue, but nearly every visible crack was sealed. The room felt different already. The wind outside still roared through the valley, but the whispers inside the cabin were softer, fainter. The small space seemed to hold the heat from the stove longer than it had all week. Mara sank into her chair, exhausted but triumphant. Over the next morning, she checked each wall again. The mixture had hardened further overnight, and the gaps that had once allowed the wind to pierce the cabin were now blocked by a solid, rough, textured barrier. She tested it with her hand. Cold still lingered, but it was trapped outside rather than cutting through the wood. For the first time, the cabin felt like a shelter instead of a sieve. As the day wore on, she continued to refine her work. Small cracks near the ceiling, narrow slits along the floor, tiny gaps in the corners. Every imperfection was filled with the mixture. She patted each section firmly, making sure the paste adhered properly and would withstand the freeze-thaw cycles of winter. By evening, the cabin looked transformed. The logs themselves had not changed, but the seams between them were now solid, creating a visual impression of walls that could hold heat for months. Mara stepped outside briefly to inspect the surroundings. The first snow of winter was falling steadily now, coating the roof and barn in a pale white layer. The wind tugged at her coat, but she felt something she had not in weeks: confidence. If the walls held, she would survive. The fire would not be her only weapon against the cold. Her labor, ingenuity, and understanding of natural materials would do most of the work. Inside, she lit another fire and placed a kettle on the stove. Steam rose, filling the cabin with warmth and a faint scent of pine and ash. Mara moved from wall to wall, testing her handiwork, her heart lifting with each touch. This was more than survival. It was mastery of her domain. The wind was a constant, but now it had no dominion over her small cabin. Night fell, and the valley darkened under heavy clouds. The fire flickered against the walls, casting dancing shadows. Outside, the snow continued to fall, thick and relentless. Mara sat beside the stove, watching the flames. She could hear the wind hitting the newly sealed logs, but it no longer whistled through the cracks. Instead, it slid across the surface, impotent, as if acknowledging defeat. For the first time since she had arrived, Mara allowed herself to relax completely. She had built more than walls. She had built security, warmth, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing one can outsmart the elements. She looked around the cabin, every corner now reinforced by the mixture she had crafted. The sand, clay, and wood ash had combined to create something stronger than any barrier wood alone could provide. She felt a surge of pride. This cabin, small and humble though it was, could withstand the worst winter the valley had to offer. The wind outside rose again, more powerful than before, rattling the roof shingles and shaking the barn door. Mara listened carefully. The sound no longer chilled her. It was merely a reminder that winter was coming. And now she was ready. The cold might rage, but it would not breach her walls. It would not find her here. Not now, not ever again. Mara leaned back beside the stove, brushing ash from her hands, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The storm could come. She had learned from the land, from her grandfather's stories, from her own hands. And tonight, the little cabin stood as proof. Solid, warm, unyielding. And for the first time since the cold arrived, the little cabin felt almost warm. Mara leaned back against the wall, listening to the wind outside. It still howled across the valley, rattling the barn door and shaking the bare trees, but inside, the air was calm and steady. The fire crackled gently, its warmth no longer being stolen by the gaps in the logs. She let herself close her eyes for a moment, savoring the rare peace of a winter night in the mountains. By morning, the snow had piled a few inches deep across the yard, blanketing the small creek that ran beside the cabin. Mara dressed quickly, layering her woolen clothes before venturing outside. She carried a small shovel to clear the path and test the cabin's endurance against the cold. Every log wall she touched felt solid, the mixture of sand, clay, and ash now fully hardened. No frost seeped through. The cabin was holding. Over the next several days, she observed the performance of her handiwork. The wind rose to its fiercest, whipping through the valley with teeth-bearing force, yet the interior of the cabin remained comfortable. Mara marveled at the difference. She burned far less wood than she had the previous winter, and the heat lingered long after the fire had dwindled to embers. The little cabin had been transformed into a fortress against the cold. Word of Mara's ingenious mixture began to spread. One morning, Daniel Carter, a neighboring rancher, rode up, curiosity in his eyes. "Heard you've done something with this place," he said, dismounting his horse. His boots crunched against the snow as he approached the cabin. Mara opened the door, inviting him in. Warm air greeted him, and he rubbed his hands together. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, glancing at the walls. "I've never felt a cabin hold warmth like this during a full blizzard." She smiled faintly. "I used sand, clay, and ash. Mixed it carefully, pressed it into the cracks between the logs." Daniel ran a hand along the walls, impressed. This could change everything for folks out here. You're saving firewood, keeping the cold out. This is brilliant." Encouraged, Mara began experimenting further. She mixed slightly different ratios of sand, clay, and ash for smaller cabins and sheds, testing each mixture until it performed optimally. Soon her methods were quietly adopted by neighbors, who visited to learn the technique and seal their own homes against winter's cruelty. As the months passed, Mara's cabin endured storm after storm. Snow buried the yard in thick blankets, winds screamed through the valley, and temperatures dropped well below zero. Inside, the heat from the stove remained trapped, and Mara rarely felt the chill she had once endured relentlessly. She even grew comfortable hosting occasional travelers who sought shelter, amazed by the cabin that seemed impervious to winter's fury. One evening, during a particularly harsh storm, Mara sat beside the fire, watching snow swirl violently against the window panes. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the lonely days of preparation, the struggle to understand the right mixture, the long hours kneeling and pressing paste into each crack. All of it had led to this: security, warmth, and the confidence of having mastered her environment. When spring arrived, melting snow revealed a valley refreshed and vibrant. Flowers peeked through thawing earth, and the creek gurgled with renewed energy. Mara stood outside, leaning on her shovel, surveying the cabin she had fortified with her own hands. The walls, dry and solid, glowed warmly in the morning sun, a testament to ingenuity, patience, and determination. Even after years passed, the cabin continued to resist the cold, becoming something of a legend among local ranchers. Mara's technique, simple yet effective, spread quietly throughout the region. Sand, clay, and wood ash, materials often overlooked, became the secret to surviving winters that once seemed unmanageable. Mara never grew complacent. Each winter she reinforced the cabin further, experimenting with thicker layers and slight adjustments. But she always remembered the lesson learned that first winter, that determination, knowledge of the land, and careful work could bend the world to her will without destroying it. The wind continued to rage outside, yet inside Mara's cabin remained steadfast, warm, and unyielding. And in the quiet moments beside the fire, she could finally rest, knowing she had built a home that would never again let the cold in. Her little cabin stood as proof, not of luck, not of chance, but of human ingenuity and resolve. Winter could rage for decades, but Mara's home would hold firm. Sand, clay, and wood ash had become her shield, and through them she had conquered the cold forever.